Now we've looked at Stefan's law and Vine's law, what we can do is we can start to see if there's any pattern to the stars. We've got to look at two things for this. One is stellar classes, so we've got to be able to put stars into different classes. And then we've got to look at this thing called a Heartspring diagram, which is crucial to understanding why stars are different, how they're different in terms of their size and their luminosity, and how this tells us about the way that stars develop. So first thing is, we think from what we've done in Vine's law that we can work out how hot stars are. It turns out that method is not brilliant. What happens is that actually plotting that curve and measuring the brightness of a star at all the different wavelengths is quite difficult. If you just think about an example of that, the sun's light comes through the atmosphere, but that effect's happening all the time to all stars as the light comes down through the atmosphere, unless you're looking at them with a space telescope. Even if you do that, then there's lots of stuff floating around in space, so sometimes you don't quite get the correct curve. That gives you the wrong temperature, which gives you then the wrong size when you're trying to work out the area from the luminosity. So it all can go a little bit wrong if you're not careful. So in fact, stars aren't classified according to their lambda max, which you might expect. They're put into spectral classes. The spectral classes have a very strange order historically. It went A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, but in fact it turned out that those classes weren't quite right. So as with so many things in astrophysics, we have to deal with the history. So we end up with this slightly strange order, O, B, A, F, G, K, M. You have to remember the order of these spectral classes, so there's a silly little rhyme to help you remember this. What people say is O, B, A, fine, girl or guy according to your preference, kiss me. So that's the order of spectral classes. Learn that little rhyme and it'll tell you the order they're in. But they're in the order of the temperature. So class O stars are the hottest stars above 25,000 Kelvin, and so on, working our way down. You'll work out the sun is somewhere in here. A class G star down to the red stars at less than 3,500 Kelvin. But how can we tell these temperatures? Not just from the lambda max. What we can tell is by looking at the absorption lines. So if we have a little look at this animation, that'll help us. So all stars are behaving pretty much like black bodies. So they're giving off a continuous spectrum of light. This is coming from the plasma on the edge of the star. But then once the light leaves the edge of the star, it has to go through the star's atmosphere, which is made of different things according to the temperature of the star. So you'll notice that we could, at the moment, we've got the whole spectrum with no absorption lines in it. But the very hottest stars have ionized helium in their atmosphere. So if I'm here, down here in a class G star, you won't see those lines. But if I go over here into a class O star, then you'll see the ionized helium lines appear. So if we see those lines, even if our lambda max doesn't tell us that the temperature is very high, it's still in spectral class O, because only stars at this kind of temperature have that kind of stuff in their atmosphere. It might seem fairly obvious that hydrogen is the most common line, so you'll see hydrogen lines right through the classes of stars, but you'll also notice in there that the intensity of the lines changes. Little point to notice here, because it peaks in the middle, if you see that sort of image, it might be a star at 25,000 Kelvin, or it might be a star down at 57,000 Kelvin. So you've got to look for some other lines to classify the stars, not just those ones. But that is in the visible spectrum. That's what's called the Balmer series. You might remember from Unit 1. That's electrons being raised up from the second shell in a hydrogen atom. That's what gives that series of lines in the visible spectrum. Remember, if they moved up out of the first shell, those lines are in the ultraviolet over here somewhere. Okay, but different materials give you different absorption lines. What you're actually going to see as you go through the spectrum is a combination of these different lines, and hopefully you can see there that according to what lines you see, that will tell you what class of star it is. So here's the same sort of information on the diagram. Here's our hydrogen-Balmer series line, which covers pretty much all stars. Okay, again, just to notice it peaks in the middle, so if you see it at this kind of intensity of how thick that line is, and you don't know if it's at this kind of temperature or this sort of temperature, you can look for what else you get. So if it's a hot star, it'll have some helium absorption lines. If it's a cooler star, you won't see the helium ones. You might start to see some ionized metals down here. Okay. So have a look at those questions if that helps. So here's a kind of picture of all the stars. You'll notice that OB, a fine girl or guy, kiss me. They're actually divided into different subcategories from 1 to 10 for each one. So a B0 star is the hottest B star, goes down to a B9 star. And you get these spectral lines like we've seen before, not quite as clear as the animation as always, because these are real photographs. But you start to see, for example, things like these very strong sodium ionized lines down here, which are much weaker up here, which tell you about the class of the star. So that leads us to this thing, the Heartspring-Russell diagram, which is crucial in understanding how stars evolve. Here's the sun for reference, and it plots onto this diagram. So have a look carefully at the axes of this diagram. We've got temperature along the x-axis, and notice the temperature is going down. And notice this is a kind of log scale, so it's doubling for every equal step along the x-axis. Here's our absolute magnitude. Note this scale looks like it's going down, but of course -10 is the brightest star. So again, this is a log scale to do with the luminosity of the star. Here's the sun on that, so you'll notice that the sun has got an absolute magnitude here, and it's got a temperature about 6,000 Kelvin here. And what we can do is we can look at other stars that we might get and plot them on this diagram. So if we had a star that was hotter than the sun but the same luminosity, well, the only way you could be hotter but the same luminosity, if you think about the formulas you know, the luminosity, the power output has to do with sigma times T to the 4th times the area. So if the temperature is hotter, the only way the luminosity can be the same as if the area is smaller. Notice the colours change, so it's gone blue, and we've moved over to the left of the diagram because this star is hotter, so it's gone left, but the same luminosity, same absolute magnitude, so it stayed the same place horizontally. Okay, but what you find with this is that doesn't actually happen, because the reason that stars are hotter than the sun, generally speaking, is because they've got more fuel burning inside them, and therefore they're also brighter. Okay, so here's a big blue star, which is blue because it's hot. Why is it hot? Because it's big, it's burning more fuel. So what we find is that most stars end up plotting along this red line pretty much, which is called the main sequence. Okay, and this just depends on how big the star is. So if it's a cool star, why is it cool? Because it's small. Okay, so it still ends up plotting down here somewhere. Okay, if it's a kind of orangey red star, that means it's a bit hotter, and therefore why is it hotter? Because it's bigger. And we find that all stars in their main hydrogen burning phase come along this line here called the main sequence. Okay, but interestingly, if we plot all the stars we've got, these are the stars that are nearest to us, these are the stars that are brightest, can plot them both. Okay, what you'll notice is, although I've told you that most of the stars plot somewhere along this main sequence, we do get stars up here, and we also get some stars down here as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. Well, how can a star be up there? Because this is a star which is not very hot, but it is very bright. Let's see if we can put one of those on there. So temperature's about right, but whoop, there it goes. So here's a star like this. Okay, fairly obviously you'll notice it's about the same colour as the sun, so it's about the same temperature, but it's much, much brighter. The only way that can be possible is if it's hugely big. So here are our giant stars. You'll also see that there are stars down here. How can you be down there? Well, you must be a very hot star, but also be very dim. Okay, I'm going to make that a little bit cooler over here somewhere. So there it is. Okay, guess what that's called? Well, it's a white star and it's very, very small. So here's our white dwarfs down here. Here's our red giants over there. So if I can put that together onto a diagram that you can see a little bit more clearly. Okay, we get this kind of pattern. We get giant stars, we get supergiants up here, we get white dwarfs. Here's our main sequence. Notice this is a nice pretty diagram. It's got colours, so we've got red stars. Don't really get green stars, okay? That's just to try to make it a bit clearer. Maybe not helping. These stars are white, really. And then up here to our blue stars, which are very, very hot. So this was a really important diagram because it told us there weren't stars just any old place, okay? There are stars along here, and then there are these particular groups of stars which aren't on the main sequence. And what astronomers realised in the way I have heard it explained, which is quite good, I think, is it's a little bit like walking into a garden. You see seedlings, you see seeds, you see flowers, you see seed heads on flowers, and you're trying to work out how plants work. You can't sit and watch a plant grow because it takes billions of years for stars to evolve, so it's no good looking at a star and waiting for it to change. So what you have to do is you have to look at all this picture and work out why this is, and the conclusion you come to is that all the stars start off on the main sequence, but as the star gets older it starts to expand and turns into a giant. Once it's turned into a giant or a supergiant, what happens then is it dies, and as we'll see, supergiants turn into one kind of body, but giants, right, blow off their outside layers. You just get left with a small inside bit, and that's where the white dwarfs are. The white dwarfs can then cool down because they're not doing fusion anymore and down here. So we'll talk about stellar evolution, but this diagram is what allowed it to be understood in the first place. And you need to be able to draw that diagram well for the exams. You need to be able to actually put numbers on these two axes and work out what kind of stars go in which place, particularly this main sequence where these are the big stars which are hottest and live shortest lives. These are the very long-lived dim red stars which are burning up their small supply of hydrogen very slowly and therefore have a very long lifetime.